What a gift, Mr. Brooks. You guys saw this, I'm sure. This piece felt so particularly relevant to our work, to what we are trying to do with schools. It, for me, popularized so much of the wonk that we are trying to instantiate in the way we do schools in America. But for sure, we know that as political as this divide gets, as wonky as this issue is, it's also mandatory for us to have a better country. And yours was the first piece. I'm sure you don't have to tell anyone in this room. I mean, I don't love the title, to be clear.
Neither do I.
Broke America. But David's take on our institutions of higher education that have not only been driven by this notion of meritocracy, but in fact influenced an entire pre-K through higher ed system in America to also be driven by these same standards was amazingly profound for me and for so many of us. Because as what he describes as the solution to the problem with meritocracy is also one which requires us to measure the skills that we know matter most, what he calls non-cognitive issues that we want to see manifest in each of our young people, like curiosity and traits like courage and critical thinking, what we at XQ have described as the competencies, and as you know, 37 of them, deep, deep, deep. But David, this piece has both gotten, I mean, you are a very popular writer, so lots of things get lots of attention, but I have found this piece has really gotten a different kind of attention at where we are in this movement.
Yeah, it's probably my most read piece of my lifetime.
Wow.
So I think there are like 2 to 3 million readers so far. And so it touched a nerve, partly because it sort of explained the election in some form. But also, I think the optimistic thing for me has been I expected, A, never to get invited back to an Ivy League campus, but B, to have lots of criticism. Mm-hmm. And of course, there's some criticism, that's part of the job. But it's felt like I'm pushing on an open door. And to be honest, coming to a place like this, it's like I'm imagining Candyland. And then I go to the Mellon Auditorium, and it turns out Candyland is real. Like, you guys are all doing this. And so it's been rewarding to see how much is being done and how much the typical email I got after the piece was, I want you to know I went to Harvard, and my daughter goes to Stanford, and my son goes to Penn, but I agree with you. And so they have to mention all their credentials before they, but it mostly a sense of agreement. And so all I was doing was channeling the trends that are already out there.
Well, yes. But, okay, so I grew up in PG County, first generation American. If I didn't say I went to, well, Spelman and then Northwestern Law School, I felt like I couldn't be invited in the room. Mm-hmm. I felt like this idea of an imposter syndrome was real. That unless my immigrant mother couldn't figure out a way as a single parent in this country to not only allow us access to the meritocracy, which was our American dream, because nowhere in my lineage could I ever envisage being at this table with you without it. And but for an America that let folks like my Black immigrant mother access it, I don't know what my life would look like. So as we reflect on this American dream that creates a step-by-step approach that our most elite institutions set the standard for, and we try to work so that everyone has rise to at least be able to access it, how do we, as we challenge that meritocracy, how do we battle with that paradigm shift that you're asking in the disruption? Because if folks like me and my mama didn't have a pathway to get to it, that financial aid, that only America would have afforded us and people like me and so many of us in this room and so many that we're fighting for today, how do we reconcile those two truths?
Yeah.
That the meritocracy created inequity, but it also fostered equality and equity.
Yeah, well, I came to this through politics, and I write about education, but mostly I write about politics. And why is the diploma divide the central divide in our politics?
And it is. And by that, I mean, as we look at the data, the biggest difference between the voting population was educational attainment.
Yeah, and it's not only the political divide, it's a caste system and a lifestyle divide. And so why is it that people with high school degrees die 8 years sooner than people with college degrees? Mm-hmm. Why is it they're more likely to be obese? Why is it they're 5 times more likely to die of opioid addiction, more likely to have kids out of wedlock? The one that gets me is that high school grads are 2.4 times more likely than college grads to say they have no close friends. They're less likely to go to a park. They're less likely to go to a hobby organization or a civic organization. Why has this chasm opened up between just 4 more years of schooling? And it's because we've created not only the 4 years of schooling, but entire parenting styles, an entire society, entire hiring decisions based on these academic credentials, and more or less based on IQ and GPA.
Yeah.
And IQ is important. If you're going to be a nuclear physicist, it helps to be smart. But I mentioned in that piece the Terman study, which is a study that followed super high IQ kids, top 1% or top 0.1%, all through life, and they did well. They became academics, they became lawyers and doctors, but there were no transcendent geniuses in this group. There were no creative people. There were no people who directed fantastic movies or led to big innovations. So IQ is important, but it's not the most important thing. And GPA, there's pretty much zero correlation between GPA and life outcomes. And that's just a gigantic non sequitur that we prepare students in one environment for a world that's a very different environment. And so I think one of the things that's happening in this room is let's make schools more like life. Mm-hmm. And the broader thing is, who are you? I mean, you probably did well in school, I'm guessing, if you got a Northwestern Law School and Spelman. But
not according to the SATs or the LSATs.
Okay, see. And so, to me, the most important part of you, it's not your IQ, though that's important. The most important part is your emotional regulation and in my view, the driving passion of your soul. What are you interested in? What do you want? And do you have a sense that you're living out of your depths? And so I used to teach at Yale off and on for 20 years. I only taught at schools I couldn't have gotten into. And I had a kid named Alex. And Alex had every privilege under the sun. He went to Harvard Westlake School in LA. I gave him his only A- at Yale. He interned on Wall Street and had a Bloomberg terminal in his dorm room. And I loved being around Alex because he was a bro. And I'd mentioned somebody I'd interviewed that week, and in the middle of class, he'd say, "David, you're being a dick. Stop name dropping." And I kind of liked it. We went back and forth. Actually, at one point, we had a woman in the class named Zara from Ghana, a more communal, respectful culture than Harvard
She's
Westlake.
like, what? You called someone a dick?
And she was like, she raised her hand and said, "We don't appreciate the way Alex is talking to you, Professor Brooks." And I said, "Okay, let's take a vote in the class. Who's with Zara? Who's with Alex?" It was 24-1 on Zara's side. But the main thing was, after he graduated, he got fired from that firm, that Wall Street firm. And he called me at age 25, 26, totally crushed. His voice was different, his mood was different, his whole affect, all the cockiness was gone. Mm-hmm. And he had been educated, succeeded in the world that we wanted to succeed in. But he's what they call an insecure overachiever. People who don't have the foundation of their life and they think they can fix it by building a new story up on top. And he suffered from what I came to call a telos crisis, a crisis of purpose. And so he was good at playing the game, but he never knew, why am I doing this? And there's a saying from Nietzsche, he who has a why to live for can endure any how. If you know why you're doing it, if the passion is there, then you walk through walls. And he knew how to play the game, but nothing else. Mm-hmm. And so even the kids, let alone the kids who were failing by excluding them, the kids we're helping are not thriving. And I saw that at Yale constantly. I now teach in Chicago. And I see the same thing. Students would come up to me and say, I'm the only person at Yale who, and what they're about to say is, who doesn't belong here? And I stop them. If every time somebody says, I'm the only person who, then everything they're about to say is wrong, because everybody is feeling this way. And so it's a hollowing out of who we are as humans that our system is now doing. And it's not because of any of the people in the system. It's because of the legacy of the assumptions that were built into it 80 years ago.
But that legacy was also one about equity. So as much as this piece focuses on higher education and talks about the changes of the then president of Harvard that knew that although who had access to that was a certain archetype that he rightfully believed didn't have any greater intelligence of others. We called them WASPs at the time. And so if we measured talent, defined as IQ, because talent could be equally distributed. So that resonates. We also know that one has to be prepared to succeed in the demands of higher ed. And so in 1906, when Carnegie and Emerson and Charles Eliot, the then president of Harvard, described what we now call the Carnegie Unit, a seat time basis for learning everything you need to know in order to be ready for higher ed, that system of the Carnegie Unit did two things. It, one, prepared for, as I try to be a student of history, it, one, prepared for a Southern immigration that would ensure all of us had a baseline of intelligences across the disciplines that we needed for a new, what would be the industrial and then knowledge-based economy. And it also created an articulation between our systems so that the exit criteria of high school ought to reflect the entrance criteria of higher ed. Again, that was very equity-minded because opportunity wasn't equally distributed, but the idea was talent could be if we could measure it right. We're now in a world that has better measurements, but the same kind of dichotomy and inequity when it comes to the gaps in opportunity and attainment. How do you think about merging these two skills that we know how to measure knowledge, we think, certainly gotten better about it. We are not adept at all at measuring what the piece describes as non-cognitive skills. We have a new impetus yesterday. Timothy Knowles, head of Carnegie, sat with the head of ETS, Amit, and they wrestled through the kinds of ways that we need to measure, and what we measure will matter. But our entire system was designed around these assessments, not only as a means of selecting and sorting, it became that way, but really as a means of ensuring true equality, true equity that's now not such a good word to use, but certainly true fairness and the epitome of the American dream. How do we reconcile these now?
Yeah, I mean, I think they made some, in the Carnegie era or the Conant era, they made some false assumptions. The first was they overvalued intelligence and undervalued temperament and motivation. The second, they believed that intelligence was genetic and therefore wouldn't be affected by environment. There's no such thing as a trait that's genetic, not affected by environment. Third, they underestimated the extent to which the rich would game the system. and the rich can invest massively in their kids. You probably know the statistics from Daniel Markovits. The average college-educated invests 10 million bucks in each kid, if you include tuition, trips to Europe, trips to museums. So how are the kids supposed to compete with that? And so they underestimated, so the Raj Chetty data that kids from the top 1% of earners are 77 times more likely to get into an Ivy League school than kids from the bottom end of the distribution. By Yale, I would look at my kids and they'd all I'd mention Chartres Cathedral. And 3/4 of my kids said, yeah, I've been there.
Yeah, I have.
And so it would they made those assumptions. Mm-hmm. And then I think the thing we have to wrestle with, and I don't have a good answer here, is not everything that matters is measurable through data, especially about human beings. And so I think the challenge is how to assess without reducing them to standardization. Mm-hmm. And partly the data just leaves out what most of us would care about. When I married my wife, I didn't say, what were your test scores, by the way? Like, go to church, it's not like the Beatitudes are, blessed are the double 800s. But to me, I wrote this book years ago based on the distinction that there's the resume virtues and the eulogy virtues. And the resume virtues are things that make you good at your job, and the eulogy virtues are you honest, courageous, capable of great love. And we all know the eulogy virtues are more important, but which ones do our parents emphasize when we're students? Which one do classes emphasize? Even at higher ed, just once I want one of my students to come up to me and say, I really want to major in accounting, but my parents are forcing me to major in French poetry. And that will never happen because parental anxiety turns out to be the most powerful force in the universe. And it has the effect of distorting. And one of the things that happened when we focused on the measurements was we lost, to me, the moral development of this child. There's a school in Britain called the Stowe School, and the headmaster said, we try to turn out graduates who are acceptable at a dance, invaluable at a shipwreck. And it used to be true that the moral formation of the child was the central agenda item of the educational system. And that sort of got squeezed out. And so we wonder why 45% of high school kids say they're hopeless and despondent. I had a girl who was a student of mine. She said, I've had 4 boyfriends, and they all ghosted me at the end. So of course I'm filled with distrust because nobody had taught those young men, you have to have a breakup conversation. Here's how to do it. Just the basic social skills. How do you break up with somebody without crushing their heart? How do you offer criticism in a caring way? The basic social skills. I'm not any better than anybody else. I suck at ending conversations gracefully. And so my only go-to move was, I got to go to the bar and get a drink. So I went to my high school reunion, and I had to leave after 20 minutes because I was so drunk. And what I'm trying to describe is a dehumanization process that happened with the best of intentions. And so I think what you guys are involved in is a rehumanization. And sometimes I feel all of American society is a battle between the forces of dehumanization and the forces of rehumanization.
Wow, thank you. It's actually very profound and inspiring. So as I dissect your piece, along with others that have, I see 6 big themes that I'd love for you to riff off, okay? So the first is, as you said, the system overrates intelligence, big time, as opposed to these other skills that make the difference. Success in school is not the same as success in life. And this is something that many of us, I certainly wouldn't have known that there was a difference. I think grit comes from, in my world, certainly not schools, but just like gritting it out on the American dream, that the game is rigged. Say more about that. You said rich parents know how to work the game. And that your piece said to me and others that it's rigged. What do you mean by that?
Well, if kids who grow up with a family making $200,000 are way more likely to have pre-K in their life. Mm-hmm. By 8th grade, they're 4 grade levels higher than other kids. They're, a lot of colleges now, the Princetons of the world, the super elite schools, say no tuition. But you can't get into Princeton. I can tell you as a veteran teacher at Yale, getting into Yale is a family business. It takes a lot of investment. It takes a lot of driving. And those kids have just huge advantages because of the family they were born into. And so Conan, when he tried to reform the system, he decided, I don't want us to be finishing schools for the children of privilege. But we wound up with a system where the schools are finishing schools for the children of privilege. And so in my view, if we looked at, the rich people are always going to game every system. So we're never going to get away from that. But if we looked at skills that are more democratically distributed, like who's kind, who's a good teammate, who has drive. And to me that, curiosity and motivation are the things that are neglected. And so we've spent a lot of time, in part because of great scientists like Danny Kahneman and people like that, looking at decision-making process in the prefrontal cortex. To me, and we've had a revolution, a wonderful revolution in how we understand the emotions. And so when our educational system was designed, people thought reason was separate from the emotions. And that they were like a teeter-totter, and if you were being rational, you had to be unemotional. Now we know that's wrong. And that emotions are how you assign value to things, and if you can't assign value to things, you can't make decisions. You're only as smart as your feelings. But the third thing we've neglected, and we're still neglecting, is the midbrain. It's the motivational set. It's the reward networks. It's dopamine and all that kind of stuff. How do we decide? It's a mystery to me. Like, I can decide what to order on the menu, but I can't decide what to like. Why did I resonate with history but not with something else? Why do some things cause a flicker of just drive? And I think these are still basically mysterious. I once asked Danny Kahneman, why did you become a social psychologist? This is a guy who spent his life and got a Nobel Prize studying decision-making. He said, I really have no idea. I read an interview with a painter, and she was asked, why did you become a painter? And she said, I love the smell of paint. It was just like aesthetic. My daughter, when she was 5, she walked into an ice hockey rink and felt immediately at home. She's now 30 and she coaches hockey in LA. She just found her thing. How does that happen? I think it's misunderstood. But somehow, if you can find, those of you who are in the fields, if we could understand where the sparks come from, and then if we could find a way to assess in a way that operates the full human. And toward the end of my piece, I tried to gesture toward things that I see out there, mastery learning transcripts, the narrative assessments. To me, to understand a human being, you have to tell a story about them. Only a story captures all the different influences that go into a life. And so a transcript is not a story. And so to me, that's to be fundamentally filled in. And what's exciting to me is that the parameters of the possible widen when I walk in this room. And I just, the little conversations, reading those books over there, it's like a moment where we have the ability, in part because of all the work that people like Angela Duckworth have done on non-cognitive skills. And so we have a better grip on their importance and their centrality.
And now we have technology that's finally caught up with this vision to be able to master and measure in the right way. 3 other points from your piece. One, this first you've talked about here today, meritocracy created the American caste system. I remember in the early days when we began talking about the achievement gap, I said, think of it as that. We don't call it that, but it feels like that. But to read your piece and reconcile that again in my own life. So that was the way out of poverty. And in so doing, did I and my family become somebody who perpetuates this caste system. It's an amazing emotional journey to both want it, feel rewarded, and like I'm my ancestors' wildest dreams as a result, quoting Ava DuVernay, and then to now be a perpetrator of it. How do we reconcile that?
Yeah, I mean, in my family too, we were, we immigrated here, and my grandfather got into City College, a free college in New York, and then he got to go to Columbia Law School. Yeah. So it did create, for years, some social mobility. It just is not doing it anymore.
So.
And it's generated this populist backlash that led to the election of Donald Trump. And so it's interesting that to restore the ripping in our society, the schools and the meritocracy have to be part of that. And Priya mentioned, weaving. I have a nonprofit called Weave, so I'm very happy Priya mentioned that. And what I see with the weavers in our community is their social, and what weavers are people who are living in the neighborhood where they work, and they're rebuilding trust. And they are social geniuses. They are just tremendous at relationship. And their motivations are moral motivations. People say people are selfish. I meet altruistic people every day who are profoundly moving. I remember I met a woman in Florida who, she was helping kids cross the street after elementary school. And we asked her, do you have time to volunteer in your neighborhood? And she said, no. And we said, what are you doing after this? And she said, well, on Thursdays I take food to the hospital. So people have some nice food. And we said, do you have time to volunteer in your neighborhood? And she said, no, I have no time at all. To her, it was just being a neighbor.
Yeah.
And so those sorts of appreciating those sorts of skills and giving them the same status and respect and prestige that we give to an investment banker. And why, we think it's silly. There's a building over here called Daughters of the American Revolution Hall, DAR Hall. And it used to be you were really proud that your family came over on the Mayflower. Now we kind of think it's kind of pathetic. It should be pathetic to think your measure is because you got through Stanford. It should be like, why are we making these fine status distinctions between Williams and Emory or between Princeton and Penn? These are completely bogus distinctions. I visited 150 colleges every 3 or 4 years. And I can tell you, if I'm in any room with students from any of the top 200 colleges, I couldn't tell what school I was in, what ranking they're in, except for at number 1, they would tell me we're at Harvard. Yeah. But aside from that, talented is just broadly distributed if we regard talent as more than just GPA.
Well, I can't tell you enough that, listen, change only comes from, as you said, populism and a new way of thinking. Your piece has popularized the wonk and the work of so many in this room and so many others in ways that I actually have not seen in my lifetime. So we are ever grateful for your forcing a country to think about these issues in deep ways, for connecting them to not only our societal ideals, but our social fabric. I appreciate that this is 2 million strong. I'm sure it's just the beginning. 2 other things I just want to conclude around this piece, and again, I've read it and reread it, and I'm sure all of you will as well. You said both of these here, but I'd love to restate them as we conclude, that the meritocracy damaged the psyches of the American elite, those that benefited from it. And that it, in so doing, perhaps provoked a populist backlash, that we are really reconciling how to find and blaze a unified path forward. For us in this room, schools, America that made the first in the world, to do high school as a universal right, to think about workforce preparation and the adolescent learner, we think this is the way that we can find unity and who we are as Americans with ripple effects abroad and shake ourselves of the divide around these issues that unite us. Are we Pollyannish?
We don't really have a choice. So, I'm excited to see what people in this room end up doing. And one of the things that, just my final thought is that one of our problems is we have one system. We have one mountaintop and one way to get there. And we need to live in a society with multiple mountaintops. And so what excites me about the different schools is we shouldn't all be trying to be the one thing. And the diversity of all the different and radical rethinking is just tremendously exciting to me. So thank you all.
Thank you.